All right, the final segment on who would I trust is in relation to churches. Well, churches, overall, I consider most of them to be among the most extreme concentrations of bias and manipulation in our midst. There is some good news, but that's not especially good news as far as who would I trust. However, this is the good news, because churches are open about their use of manipulation, whereas governments tend not to be quite as open, that churches have some credibility in relation to mythology and manipulation and symbolic language and propaganda. We'll give a simple example. The deceptive mythology of Santa Claus is clearly used as bribery to attract the obedience of children or to influence children to be obedient. That's what it's for. We know it's deceptive. It's openly acknowledged that it's a deception, and that's unusual. It's not so typical that governments may admit 20 or 40 years later about something they did a long time ago, but they're still not going to admit what they're doing currently that might be very similar. Churches will say, here is a symbolic construction, and by the way, for those who have the ears to hear and the eyes to see, there's another thing going on here, but we'll come back to that. And then they say whatever they say, and then they embed through the metaphors some implications. They imply things that make it clear, again, for those who are astute and who are listening close and maybe are familiar with the code words being used and so forth. Kind of like in a joke. If people are familiar, an inside joke, if people are familiar with the double meaning, then that's how the joke is funny. Well, with the manipulations and deceptions that religious organizations do, they're useful, they're functional, and of course they're deceptive. Of course there's not really a Santa Claus. We could say outside of institutional religion, there's things like the Tooth Fairy. The Easter Bunny we might consider somewhat religious, but the Tooth Fairy, what's that? That's not a religious thing, is it? And it's in that same realm, though, as Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, and some things that are religious. So, churches actually may teach about deception and manipulation in ways that we just don't normally find emphasized in many other arenas. Mainstream media doesn't usually talk about it. Politicians don't usually talk about it, or government agencies. They tend to hide and deceive and act like they don't. Or, again, with spy agencies, they might say, yes, we assassinate people and we keep secrets and so forth, but we don't really want to talk about it. In the churches, people talk about these things. This is part of the whole process and the training and development, so to speak, that goes on with participating in religious institutions. So let's talk about mythology. Let's talk about symbolic language. Many church leaders, we'll come back to that. Many church leaders may have no direct experience or relevant authority in the matters they reference most, such as mythology and symbolic language. So there can be notable exceptions to that, though. Some religious leaders do have direct experience, do have relevant authority from direct experience. First, let us beware of those who worship symbolic language. They worship the symbolic language and then argue over literal interpretations, evidencing their proud ignorance of the meaning of symbolic language. If it's symbolic language, if it's an interpretation, it can't be literal. It's an interpretation. So anybody who uses a phrase like literal interpretation and then argues about it proudly, wow, that's a sign. All right, so some may confuse the actuality of reality with mere words, especially the word truth. very um, a very easy word to throw around, but people who think that truth can be described in words, like a particular word or a particular set of words, boy, that again, that's not a good sign for a religious leader, or for a religious leader that's reliable and trustworthy. At least that's been my experience. So dispute amongst the fanatical adherents of various religious beliefs is the key indicator of one who is more interested in words than in the actuality of what they reference, what the words reference, using labels like spirituality, divinity, or God. So dispute, like intense, contemptuous disputes, ill will, burning rage, that sense of being threatened, being intimidated, really desperately wanting other people to agree with them, or not to disagree at least. That kind of insecurity is not the distinctions of faith, divinity, grace, dignity, and so on. So people may use those terms without direct experience of them. So some people worship language, which is the perfect focus of attention for those who do not understand language yet. If they're still learning what symbolic language is, then let them argue over literal interpretations. Perfect. Eventually, they'll either pick up on what language is, or they'll run out of time. And it may be that a conversation would support their learning, for those of you who are willing to explore such a thing. So, some of these fanatics, religious fanatics, they may use the word faith very frequently. But listen for how they use it. They may actually be the enemies of faith and worshipers not of God, but of mere belief. Again, of words, of literal interpretations of symbolic language. They are fanatical idolaters, proud of their conflicts with other fanatical idolaters who happen to disagree with them. They'll go to war. They'll split their church. You know, they're split in their denomination, and they'll have the Reformed group and the New Reformed and the Counter Reformed and all this. That's not it. Or that's a different thing. That's not the distinction of God, divinity, faith. Now that's argument and divisiveness. So those institutions of divisiveness, well, they're institutions of divisiveness and of attachment to literal interpretations of symbolic language. They're religious fanatics. That's a common stage for people to go through. I certainly did. In regard to trusting such religious fanatics, all of those who worship conceptual ideologies of belief that are rooted in interpretations of the language of other people, well, they, as far as trusting them, they may as well be no more than politicians. They're dealing with ideologies and opinions and interpretations, not the truth, not the actuality. Unless they know that their interpretations are just interpretations, unless they know what symbolic language is, then, boy, not reliable ones to follow. Not good teachers, except for distinguishing the irony of arguing over interpretations of symbolic language. Rather than, conversing and exploring. That's one thing. But arguing? Wow. That's, like I said, a key indicator. So, let those folks argue desperately. If you wish, you might allow them to just argue desperately, exhausting themselves, even tormenting themselves to earn their way into a heaven that they may claim is eternal, but cannot be accessed yet. It's eternal, but can't be accessed yet. By them, at least. That's what they're claiming and asserting and admitting, is they don't know how to get into it, and they're calling it eternal. They don't know how to experience it. How familiar are they with divinity? How familiar are they with faith? They talk about the fruits of faith. Argumentiveness and divisiveness. Is that one of the fruits of faith, or is that the fruit of ignorance and anxiety? Those who have faith, we might anticipate dignity, calm, a sense of humor, peace, grace, ease, like being relaxed. So, some folks claim that heaven is eternal, but you can't get in yet, and they imply by that they've never been there, they've never experienced it. And then they go on to talk a lot about how to get there. That's a little ironic. So, if you're already firm in these distinctions of what works to trust in regard to churches, governments, institutions of education, mainstream media, cases where you're walking down the street and you encounter someone at the bus stop and you ask them, hey, has a bus gone by here recently? Well, you can rely many times on information. If you verify it with a few sources, there's a lot of things that's really reliable and easy to trust. And there's also quite a few things where it's pretty simple at some point to recognize that to trust or rely on a certain source in a certain context would be naive. So the distinction of naivety is something that we have the opportunity to learn through our exposure to religious institutions and myths like Santa Claus, as well as our interaction with mainstream media, public education systems, and governments in general. Not any one particular government, but all of them. So if you're already firm in these distinctions about what works to trust, then you can trust yourself, right? You know how to distinguish what's trustworthy or not. You can do your own due diligence. You can do your own confirmation and verification to establish. If you want to establish for sure that a bus go by, well, maybe ask a few people. Maybe you call on the phone and call up your friend and say, "Hey, have you seen the bus go by?" At some point, you get confident in a particular information. You're confident that it's accurate. However long it takes, whatever methods are used, methods come up to you, and when you're satisfied, you've got it. And you're clear about what naivety is. When you have an intuitive sense that something is unreliable, you trust your intuition. So, if you are not already firm in these distinctions and you don't have that sense of really trusting yourself, that's okay. You may trust yourself in regard to many things, but find that in regard to something you have a situation where you have a sense of confusion or bewilderment, disorientation, maybe curiosity, and you just don't know yet, and you still need to do some additional exploring or have a conversation with someone. Well, especially if you're aware of the distinction of naivety and reliability, but are still in progress in terms of developing your own skills and intuition, well, then you might wish to partner with others. Not just in regard to intuition, but logic, perceptiveness, intelligence, accurate information. What information is relevant? What should be a priority for you? You might choose to partner with others who are perceptive enough to recognize these issues, to value these issues, and to be selective in regard to trusting or not any particular source of influence or information. So you can have those conversations together, not in a mode of argument, but in a mode of exploration, cooperation, partnership, to verify, because there are some details where you can't just immediately establish what's accurate in terms of, like, you want to mix two colors together and see what color comes out. Well, there's some things you can just try and find out. Other things you're going to want to consult specialists, people who have tremendous experience in a particular subject matter, and who are reliable. And that is something for each individual to assess who to rely on. Which expert? What kind of expert? I had the occasion to lose the ability to walk about 5 years ago. Several of the people that I consulted that had licenses or degrees or other kinds of credentials that might suggest that those are people who would be experts in physiology and health, and healthcare. Well, some of those folks were not of particular assistance to me, and someone who actually had no license said to me, "Oh, you are describing," when I described my experience and symptoms to them, they said, "Oh, that sounds very familiar. I know what worked in a case very similar to yours, and I know why it worked. I can tell you what it was, and it cost you $4.50 to try it." So I tried it, and I had an overnight recovery of the ability to walk. So sometimes the way that someone's talking and the explanation they give, their willingness to give explanation, to answer a few questions, and the way that they answer those questions, it establishes there's something reliable, something trustworthy in what they're presenting. Now, it may be that I tried to apply a particular method as far as relating to recovering the ability to walk, and it didn't work for me. That's always possible. However, I trusted them. I relied on them, and it worked for me. Exploring trust could be something that you value. Who to trust, when to trust them, and in regard to what. If you'd like to comment on this presentation, you can comment on the videos, you can comment on the blog linked to the videos, and if you know how to contact me directly, such as through my YouTube channel, you can just message me through there. Feel free to do so. Thank you for your interest.